Okay, great. So yeah, welcome everyone. So we're lucky enough to have Trent here to talk about decentralized AI today. And so if anyone has any questions, maybe type them in the chat, and also feel free to jump in if you think it's a good point in the conversation. And so yeah, I've got loads of questions as well. So if people don't have any, I'd say I could take up Trent's time for the whole hour. But yeah, it'd be great to get everyone's input. So yeah, maybe just to start, Trent, I wonder, could you give us a bit about your background in AI? I think that would be really interesting. I haven't heard about that too many times before.
All right, sure. So, I grew up on a farm in rural Canada, shoveling pig manure, driving grain trucks, and hacking on computers. I didn't have very much money, so I wanted to play video games, and that's why I was hacking on computers. Weirdly, my father, the farmer, gave me a computer, and my brothers and I, fought over it and made video games. Did electrical engineering comp sci in university, but for fun, I was always hacking away. And this was the early mid '90s. I was starting to play with neural networks. I studied as an electrical engineer. The IEEE transactions and evolutionary computation just came out, and as a student, you can actually subscribe for like $10 a year. So I had those transactions and the transaction on neural networks and on fuzzy logic, all coming to my, getting mailed to me every month. I loved it. That was my breakfast reading. I just loved it. So I was just absorbing all that. And then I was hacking this on my own for fun. School became more and more of a hobby. But I just really loved hacking on AI. And I managed to parlay that into a job working for National Defense Canada, where I was doing AI to automatically classify audio radar signals. So the way that was is people drive around in tanks. You've got one driver and you've got someone else trying to figure out what's going on around. To sort of, there wasn't really good optical in every direction. So there would be a guy listening to audio radar, listening to birds flying and all that, and then basically saying, okay, that's birds flying, that's troops walking, etc. But it would be much better if rather than a person sitting there inside the tank listening, what if an AI can say, hey, there's birds flying, troops walking, etc. So that's what I was working on. I was given a fixed data set, not a lot of context, 13 different classes. And, it was over the span of, it was a summer job, right? Over the span of the summer job. And then the second summer, I managed to improve accuracy by about 10% each round. And basically, the algorithms weren't that powerful then. There wasn't enough data and so on. So I went from, I think, 55 to 65% accuracy the first summer and then another 10% the second. But I got to play with lots of AI and I loved it. It was super fun. And I got really good at, a lot of things because I was getting paid full time to work on it. So not just things like neural networks and genetic programming, but also lots of optimization and going back to, nonlinear control theory and all that stuff coming out of like Norbert Wiener's work on cybernetics, et cetera, MIT in the 50s, all this stuff, right? And remember, as an engineer, I've got, you've got training in linear systems, all that, and all of that is really, really useful. So that was sort of, I did that 97, 98, and 99. Then basically my final year undergrad, I had actually read a paper published in IEEE Transactions on evolutionary computation. Well, I had just come out of a class where I was learning, studying analog circuit design. Then I read this paper and it was basically how to do it automatically. My first thought was, oh crap, am I going to get automated away and lose my job? And my second thought was, if you can't beat them, join them. And I already knew GP a little bit. So actually I made a point, and it was written by John Koza out of Stanford and some of his collaborators, Forrest Bennett and others. So I made a point of driving to my first academic conference ever, 16 hours straight in Madison, Wisconsin, and met John and met Forrest and his collaborators. And they're like, yeah, we're not analog designers. We just think it was cool. And I'm like, okay, this is really great because it's an opening for an opportunity for someone who's actually an electrical engineer like myself and someone who's into GP, genetic programming. So I made that my final year design project along with some colleagues. And we basically, once again, school was a hobby and we just built this thing like crazy. And from day one, we treated it as a company that we were going to start. We called it Analog Design Automation Inc. And it was all about automatically synthesizing analog circuits, not just the parameters, but the automatic design of the structure itself. And that's considered a very creative act. Analog designers, they get patents all the time for, analog circuits they invent. It's, wiring together 5 or 10 or 15 transistors, resistors, capacitors. And an analog circuit, so maybe if none of you know, so digital means you've got, you're abstracting away the time into clock cycles, You know, so like 1 gigahertz means that there's 1 billion clock cycles every second that your computer goes through. And it's also digital in value, true or false, as opposed to a voltage level of 1.1 volts versus 1.2 volts versus 1.3 or whatever. And so analog basically means that you are continuous in value or continuous in time, or both. And that's what analog means. And then you can't abstract the stuff away, and it's harder. And I've always just really loved working with analog. So anyway, we did that as a company. We actually initially we brought this to prototypes, etc., to potential users, and they're like, hey, we don't even have optimization yet. Just wiggling the parameters. Can you give us that first? So we actually had to pivot the company and de-scope and just go into that, which is less creative in a sense, but it was still super fun to get good at optimization. And it was at scale. At first we were optimizing on 10 parameters. By the time we sold the company, it was at, I think, 100,000 parameters or something, at least 10,000. So really figured out how to scale it up. So we sold the company after about 4 or 5 years. I went on to do 2 things at once: a second company and a PhD. The second company was also in the same space, which is, tools for analog circuit designers, CAD tools. So, if you're a designer who works for Sony or Qualcomm or whatever, you're going to sit down, you're going to use tools. And you're going to have a circuit simulator to run the guts of the design, but then you're going to have tools around it, whether it's doing optimization, like my first company, or verification, like my second company. And so the second company was basically solving problems like, if you've got a memory bit cell, so this is a thing that holds a single bit. It's got 6 transistors typically, but it's the yield is like 1 failure in a billion or 1 in 10 billion, because you might wire together a billion of these to make a 1 gigabit memory stick, right? And of course you've got error correction and all that. But let's say its failure is 1 in a billion. Then if you want to Monte Carlo sample this to see if it's any good, you'll have to do 50 billion or 100 billion Monte Carlo samples, therefore 50 billion or 100 billion SPICE simulations. And even if simulation takes like 1 second, you're looking at like 1 month of runtime on a cluster. So, and this is actually what the Qualcomms of the world were doing at the time. And because of that, this is only for bit cells. They couldn't even conceive of doing it at larger levels. And this was around 2005-ish. And around that time, I don't know if you guys remember, Sony had shipped their PS3, but it was 1 year late. They had this IBM Cell processor, and it was 1 year late because they couldn't ramp yield. So they had 5% yields, but they were just losing money with every PS3 they shipped. So they had to. It took them about a year to ramp yield because variation was just killing them. And basically, whenever you manufacture a memory bit cell or an analog circuit or anything, it basically really pulls down there's variation, just randomness from the atoms doping the transistors and stuff, basically. So there's random fluctuations, tolerances, if you will, and traditionally it's only maybe caused your yield to go from 100% down to 98% or 95%, but in the span of like 2 process generations, from about 2002 to about 2008, that 98% turned into about 5%, and that was a big problem. And so that's we built technology to allow people to verify this very quickly. Things like estimating the yield of a memory bit cell. So instead of having to simulate 50 billion simulations, which would take a month on a cluster, we chopped it down to, in the end, about 10 minutes on a laptop with like 5 cores. And we did that not just for bit cells, but then also for larger memory circuits like memory columns and so on. And we could do statistical estimation of the tails to say, it's a 1 in a billion chance of failure versus 1.1 in a billion. But then we could also do worst case analysis to find basically faults. You might say, okay, there's the power supply voltage might be 1.0 volts to 1.5 volts. The temperature might be minus 40 degrees Celsius to plus 40, and a few other things like that. And then go and try to see if you can have a failure. And that's actually a global optimization problem. The other one is a rare event estimation problem. And there's a bunch of other problems like that. There's about 20 different AI sub-problems that we had to solve, where you can solve with combinations of optimization, regression, classification, and so on. Anywhere from 10 samples to a billion samples, anywhere from 10 input variables to 100,000 input variables. So that's what sort of AI I did. A lot of very applied AI at scale. And then with my PhD, I really loved the creative design side. And the challenge we had in the first company was, even the designs that came up with, the designs kind of looked like Rube Goldberg machines. It was things that a designer would never design, because the simulator would lie, actually. Like SPICE would think, okay, here's a cool design, but it just missed some factors that couldn't be modeled so easily. So in my PhD, I basically said, let's model the space of sane analog designs by designing a language for analog circuits. and then run through that space, that grammar of sentences, if you will, of analog circuits. And anytime you randomly draw a sentence from that language, it's going to be a same looking circuit. And what that does is incorporates all the different building blocks of analog circuits, everything from a single transistor to higher level blocks like current mirrors and OTAs and all this other crazy stuff you see in analog circuit land. So in the end, with about 20 building blocks, we had 10,000 possible different topologies, no, 100,000, sorry. And then we searched through all those possible topologies, plus the parameters for them. And we came up with like really, really cool designs in a very short amount of time. So that was sort of what I did also in my work. And that was all from the year 2004 to my PhD I finished in 2008. And then that company I kept at full-time until 2014. And then I started hacking around playing with Bitcoin in 2010, 2011. And then started hacking in more in depth in 2013. And by fall of 2014, I was full-time at it and been full-time at it ever since with Ascribe, which is basically an NFT platform in Bitcoin, and then BigChainDB, which was based MongoDB, decentralized with the BFT algorithm, basically. And then since 2017, I've been focused on Ocean, which basically pulls together all of my previous interests of AI and blockchain and incentives, all of that stuff. And the name of the game is always, one of the names of the games for me, besides the fact that it's really important for society, is simply I have a bunch of things that I want to build on top of Ocean, and I needed Ocean to do it. And they're AI-related things like AIs that own themselves, and just like there's a lot of really cool opportunities there. And so that's what I'm excited about to be building, going forward. Now that a lot of the Ocean infrastructure is there. So that was a bit of a long introduction, but hopefully it gives you some context to sort of where I'm coming from.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I was going to ask this question. Like when you built Ascribe, for example, and you were solving the IP issue, did you have AI in your mind? Did you know it was coming after? Was it always working towards Ocean?
To be honest, no. When we first started hacking on blockchain and stuff, I thought I'd been saying I thought I was saying goodbye to AI, maybe for my career, which I was a bit sad about. But blockchain is like super cool on its own, right? It's pretty compelling. And so then, it was around the time of 2016 when I was hanging out with Simon de Rouvier and others, and we were kind of riffing on what combinations there might be of AI and blockchain, and especially this idea of AI DAOs, and DAOs that are basically AIs, right? Which is really a compelling concept, and I wrote about that, thought about that, and then from that I also said, well, how else can these intersect? And I started saying, okay, well, what problems does AI have, and how can blockchain help them? Because I know that I know both fields well enough. I know. Whereas when I got started, right, I didn't even know what a crypto hash function was. I was an AI guy, not a crypto guy. So, but you learn over time, right? And so, I wrote that article, Blockchains for AI, in fall of 2016, and then I also wrote an article on blockchains for big data. And that's when, in writing those articles, it's like, oh crap, decentralized data marketplaces are the linchpin for all of this. So how do we make that happen, right? And that's been the driving vision for the last 4 or 5 years. But also knowing that once you have that, when I wrote the Blockchains for AI article, I realized that, okay, if you have decentralized data marketplaces, it solves a bunch of problems that AI people have, but also unlocks AI DAOs, right? So that's kind of where all that came from. But yeah, some of it was just like, a lot of the time, in a sense, for the love of the technology, right? Like I'm doing it, I think of it for the love of the technology, but I spend energy at it because I see that it can have a big positive impact for humanity too.
Yeah, I was just on Twitter this morning, and this debate about people saying AI is centralizing while blockchain is decentralizing came up. And I think it came from the sovereign individual originally, but it wasn't that well explored, and people are starting to repeat it. So I wonder what you think about this. Is it only that current AI is centralized, or can AI be decentralized?
Yeah, so I've been saying that for years, by the way. If you think about like a tree, right? The leaf nodes is where AI kind of affects things at the edges the most, and blockchain sort of is middle management, right? So so blockchain is if you have blockchain to replace the middle managers, it's decentralizing there. Whereas if you have the leaf nodes, there's sort of an incentive for them to get collected together, Facebook, Google style, because there's just a lot of benefit of collecting that together from a monetization standpoint, et cetera, right? There's a lot of benefits, sort of economies of scale, more accuracy, all that. More data means more accurate AI means more money, right? So I've been thinking about that for a long time, and I see exactly what you hinted at, Richard. That's traditional AI, but of course you can use blockchain technologies and other tools to decentralize AI, right? So for example, even federated learning, traditional federated learning is partly decentralizing, but it's not using blockchain per se. It's just basically doing, bringing some compute to the data at the leaf nodes. However, as it's traditionally framed, it's a bit of privacy washing. It's privacy theater, because there's still a middleman that is orchestrating everything going on, and you have to trust them. So when Google says we're doing privacy preserving federated learning, they are the middleman seeing everything going on there, and you have to trust them. So have they been trustworthy in the past with users' data? Well, you can judge for yourself, right? So that's why traditional federated learning, maybe it's the leaf nodes are fine, but the middle stuff hasn't been decentralized, and that's why I'm quite excited about the Raven protocols of the world, which are moving to decentralize that as well, right? And there's also the initiatives via the Open Mind community, which is just an awesome community, right? And they're building a lot of great tooling. So
yeah, sounds fantastic. Yeah, I completely agree. And yes, just on the AI DAOs, I'm curious, because it seems to me that you almost skipped a step. You gave the DAO full autonomy by the AI before you had this DAO of humans that were building AI. So I'm just curious about what made you make that jump. Is it that that is the more exciting application, maybe? Or do you think that DAOs that have humans in them that create AI could be an intermediate step towards that?
Well, so in my AI DAOs article, the first one, I laid out 3 possible architectures for AI DAOs. One is where you have a bunch of humans interacting with some smart contract, but that smart contract is autonomous, which, by the way, all smart contracts are basically autonomous, right? Like an AMM, it's sort of this robot that everyone's interacting with, right? But if you start to give it a bit of AI decision-making power, like imagine if it's, an AMM that is automatically running optimization internally to reduce impermanent loss, but then also keeping 10% of all swap fees for itself, and then using that to expand its footprint in some way going forward, right? So that would be an AI DAO, right? And that's where it's it's centralized in logic in a single place, and you've got humans interacting. So it's AI at the center, humans at the edges. You can flip it around, have it a smart contract at the center that is just a dumb smart contract, say an AMM, but then at the edges, it's AIs, a bunch of AIs, right? So imagine if you have a bunch of people trading against agents trading against a Uniswap pool, but instead of part humans, part AIs or bots, it's all AIs, right? And that's also, you can think of that as an AI DAO, right, as well. And the third one is a bit more generalized, where it's simply this this swarm of agents running around talking to each other. Each might have their own internal memory, each has their own resources, each has their own means of actuating it on the blockchain. And with that, they basically, try to, each of them tries to get more resources, right? And the ones that don't do so well die off, and the ones that do well keep going, right? So that's also another architecture. And that one is so general on its own. I mean, that sort of is a superset of everything else. But roughly speaking, right, AI at the center, AI at the edges, and sort of swarms of heterogeneous AI agents. And then to your question, I mean, about me making a bigger leap to the AI DAOs versus the other stuff. I mean, that's where I started, right? Just that I got excited by that from these conversations with Simon and others. And but then, in a sense, the Blockchains for AI article worked backwards to even some of the more mundane applications. And I was really glad to have sort of thought of that stuff, because it helped connect the dots, right? It's sort of like, okay, AI DAOs is a bit of the path to go to, but along the way, there's all these other things that can really help, the near-term benefits. And so the order of operations is, do those things first, like decentralized data markets, and what's needed for that, then AI DAOs. But then also, to riff on AI DAOs and to really run with it going into the future, it doesn't. Those AI-based entities don't need to live solely on blockchain. They can start to live in inside the real world, right? In real life, things like in self-driving cars, right? And then, imagine you have an Uber network of self-driving cars where each car owns itself, right? And they're all part of some automated network, like some decentralized network. Imagine that car owns itself, but once it has sort of paid for itself, it's paid off its mortgage, if you will, its car loan to Daimler or whoever manufactured it. When it has surplus, well, it's a robot. It doesn't really care, so if you program it in, where could it send its surplus? What if it sent its surplus towards all humanity in sort of a UBI type setup, right? To me, that's very exciting, right? Because rather than AI and potentially even blockchain sending a lot of the surplus of society and extra wealth to the hands of a few, especially like AI is doing right now with Google, Facebook, etc. Instead, you can leverage AI and blockchain to send all the surplus wealth to all of humanity, or other ways. But I'm especially excited by that. So, and I called that Nature 2.0. These days, it's evolved into the Sovereign Nature movement, which I think is actually a better label. So, kudos to Ed Hesse for thinking of that and driving that further. But yeah, that's sort of the order of operations. AI DAOs is what I like. The proper logical order is blockchains for AI, like Ocean and so on, and then AI DAOs, and extending into real world with Nature 2.0 type ideas.
Great, yeah, and yeah, I wonder, like, what do you think is the best way to go about implementing AI DAOs? Should we be instantiating specific AI DAOs, or do we need to be improving the tools to launch AI DAOs?
I think it's worth trying to just build specific things and see what happens, right? That to me is probably the most interesting. So, with Ocean, once we get past shipping V4 and stuff, I plan to spend a lot more time at stuff like that, seeing what we can do. I also see, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because we have a bit of the paperclip maximizer problem at risk, and I've written about that as well. And even Bitcoin itself, right, is a bit of a paperclip maximizer. It's eating up the energy of the world, right? So if you have something that is less bounded than Bitcoin, that can be problematic. So I think it's really worth trying to just build some specific things and learn about it, talk about, and see, where we should put the constraints and not, right? But I'm not too worried about, with small toys, testing things out, it shouldn't get away. Hopefully I'm not, eating my lunch on that 5 years from now, but we'll see. So yeah, I mean, I'm always a big fan of having an idea, but, rather than writing paper after paper and paper about it, sit down and build it, right? So that's why I haven't written as many of these sort of AI DAOs type articles recently, because I've got enough vision for the next, 20 years in a sense of my writings and stuff. And I'm just trying to build it now, right? And then use that as sort of the levers to build more and write more.
Yeah, great. Maybe, yeah, like one of the things that you talked about as a good test case was the art DAO. I guess maybe because like an art DAO can't take over the world. I suppose it's unlikely, but yeah, I think like Genegan is working on this sort of stuff, which looks really, really interesting. And that's one of the few examples that I can find of people building an AI DAO, which seems crazy, So
yeah. His thing, for everyone's sake, it's Abraham AI. It's really cool. And yeah, Gene was in Berlin here a couple months ago, and we had a really great visit around it. I've always been a big fan of that. And he was dreaming of that for years too, but in the last half year, he was able to basically start fleshing it out and make it a lot more real, right? And some of this generative AI stuff in NFTs is starting to get closer there too. And there's technology being fleshed out around that. So to me, that's very exciting, right? For me, it's not about, me racing to be the first. If there's a bunch of people that have been edging towards this and doing stuff, other stuff, maybe you can call it AI DAOs now too. Wonderful, right? Like, I think this is just really wonderful to explore. To me, I'm actually always a little bit shocked that there aren't more AI people flocking into this stuff, because it's so amazing, right? Like, guys, like, you can write AIs that live forever on this chain. Like, they are really new life forms, right? And I've shared this with some of my friends from the AI community, like with, my friends in the genetic programming world. And I hung out at Santa Fe Institute a couple of years ago and gave a talk with them about this, and they loved it too. They thought it was great, right? Because there's a bunch of AI people there. So some people are aware of this stuff, but it's going to be much bigger, and it's just super fun, right? and it's not only fun, there's a lot of really great applications too, like the Nature 2.0 stuff, right? Like that to me is, we can have self-owning transportation grids of automotive, of cars and trains, of roads, self-owning power grids, self-owning everything, right? Like it's really like this next level of civilization infrastructure that's sort of giving back to us too, right? And that's why, it's just like, Nature 1.0, the trees and the air and all that, it's kind of there. We don't have to pay for it. We get our air for free in most parts of the world, right? So why not, augment it with some silicon and steel and do the same thing? And that to me, like, I can't think of a greater vision, for the next 5 or 10 years to aim for.
Yeah, a point I want to build up to like letting Santiago ask a question, but it's about like the onboarding of data scientists and stuff. And you mentioned it there. I don't know, I just can't understand why AI people aren't flocking into the space, especially since like you've had these ideas since 2016 or whatever. And like across all of the professions that are coming into Web3 now, from artists to legal to, everything, it seems like data scientists, machine learning engineers are some of the last to come across, which I've been trying to figure out why that is. But yeah, that leads me up to Santiago, who
I mean, we've been too busy training our models. It's just give us some time there. No, I think number one, thank you for joining us and telling us about this. Obviously, the space is extremely exciting, but it's extremely new. Even though I'm truly surprised you've been talking about this for such a long time. Right now, I feel ashamed. But it's still very, very new. I've talked to several people that are either building DAOs or part of the Web3 community, and I've been realizing that they are a few weeks ahead of me. Like it's literally, they haven't figured it out yet, right? And specifically with DAOs, there are a lot of complications about how do you manage people? How do you control what they're doing? When you read the sort of like, hey, this is how it's gonna look like, it feels great. And you say, wow, this is amazing. But when you get down to it, it's, the actual day-to-day is really hard to manage. Sometimes there are no tools, etc. So one thing that I wanted to ask, to be really direct, if you were to start one DAO today, forget about the AI part. Let's say you have this awesome idea and you want to start a DAO tomorrow. What would be sort of like the initial steps you will go through? Like the obvious stuff that might be obvious for you, not for us. How would you organize that?
That's a good question. To be honest, I don't have a perfect answer right now, or even close, I don't think. I know I've seen some people like Cooper Turley are giving very quick recipes. So follow Cooper Turley on Twitter. And he's been tweeting actually things like, DAO starter kit, do this, right? Like set up a Discord, maybe set up a gated community using a token gated community. And, I think critically find a mission statement. So, why are you doing it, right? So, early on in Ocean, we sat down, like we implicitly knew why we were doing things, right? There was the carrot and the stick. The carrot was, we wanted to help make a more level playing field for like AI people to monetize, etc. And the stick was simply like, we saw the horrible stuff Facebook, etc. doing, and we wanted to help stop that. So, and then we had implicitly done that, but we turned it into a mission and values, and that's been very, very useful as a guide for us over the years, right? So, so write down, mission and values early on, start gathering people together, and just start doing stuff around those mission and values, right? And once you get going, you learn. So learn on the fly, and then you'll learn about different organizations of DAOs, how they could go. But I'll always be action oriented, right? Like go for something tactical, solve real problems, and go for it. And by the way, real problems don't necessarily have to be in the real world, and don't have to tie to mainstream or Web 2 or anything like that. Web 3 is big enough on its own, right? It's sort of something of people that haven't been in the Web 3 world. They come from the non-Web 3 world, and sometimes they're sort of sitting on their high horse saying, I have real problems, Web 3 doesn't have real problems. Well, sorry, Web 3 is now a $2 trillion industry, right? There's a bunch of interesting problems in Web 3 on its own, but Web 2 and other mainstream stuff is still interesting. It's just that, don't accidentally confuse one thing for the other. So going back to your question then, follow Cooper Turley, focus on a quick top-level mission values. Don't spend 4 hours navel gazing. Write it down in 20 minutes or an hour, and then with your group of people in your Discord or whatever, just figure out what problem to try to solve together, right? And also know that DAOs themselves, it's another one of these words that if you're not careful, it is going to be super vague, that you'll feel very unbounded, sort of like AI or NFT. So the way that I approach all this is to know that for any of these things, there's 20 possible definitions, and then pick a definition that you can work against in a pragmatic fashion, right? So so for DAOs, I view DAOs as the technology of blockchain basically expands the design space of governance mechanisms. Before, we had pencil and paper and a little bit of online stuff. Now we have pencil and paper and more online stuff, and especially private keys and blockchain, right? It means that all the stuff before that could be governed before, plus a whole much broader space yet, right? So we can, and think about design space of governance before, right? We have small local co-op stores. We have credit union banks. We have local hockey clubs. We have cities. We have national governments. We have United Nations. All of these are different applications of pen and paper governance technology for different shapes of human organizations. So with blockchain, you could actually use blockchain to help improve the governance of any of those. And given blockchain, you could call it a DAO, right? So it's very, so they're like, be careful not to reinvent things, to understand the past, but then to go backwards and say, what shape of organization do we want? And I think the most healthy thing is to say, okay, out there in the past, do we want to be shaped like a traditional company? Do we want to be shaped like a small scale co-op, like a large scale co-op, like another sort of commons, like Elinor Ostrom style commons, or otherwise, right? And I think, so that's the place to approach it. And I think most DAOs are well suited to be small scale co-ops or mid-sized co-ops, as the sort of the technology of the now. So as you're learning along, look at the governance, look closely at co-ops. Yeah, so I'll stop there. That's some thoughts. But as you probably have gathered, I always have an eye on pragmatism and building, and simple is good.
No, absolutely. No, we're on the same place. And regarding DAOs, the way I see them, and you're absolutely right. When I'm talking to people, everyone has a different definition of what a DAO looks like. In my mind, like the perfect DAO, it's sort of like realizing the autonomous promise. It's like, it works without me overseeing it. It works without any human overseeing it and controlling it. Now, I know that for most missions that I've been involved with, that's a sort of like a future state, sort of like the goal, but there is usually humans involved. Somebody has to make decisions. Somebody has to organize the work. That's the part that I aspire to get out of the way. I don't know if AI is going to be the answer. I don't know what is going to be the answer for certain projects, but that's definitely what I have in mind. Final question before I let somebody else to speak. Do you have any specific recommendations on how to tokenize these communities? Like, would you issue a token that you create for that community? What would you do if you have any specific recommendation?
It's a good question. I think to start with, some communities have introduced tokens right away and it worked out for them, others haven't. My personal preference is leverage intrinsic motivation for as long as you can, because then you're going to get the community members you want, which means don't have tokens right away. Find yourself working with those people for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and then start thinking about a token, right? That I think would be healthy. And then when you do, and you also then have the benefit of, you can do retroactive airdrops if you choose, but you can choose together as a community, right? And you can do a retroactive airdrop based on people's contributions in the past, right? And then even before you do tokens, you could start, you can get grants from, Ocean Protocol or otherwise. So let's say, here's another example of a DAO, right? You're a little collective, this or otherwise, and I guess Algovera is getting grants from Ocean Protocol, but maybe as a sort of, call it a mini DAO of 3 people, 10 people, whatever, you take that grant money and you allocate amongst yourself based on what you all believe each other has contributed over the last 1 month, 3 months, whatever time frame, right? And there is tools emerging for that, like Coordinate, which are really cool for this, right? And we're using those in Metacartel Ventures, and it's quite nice, right? I quite like it. And there's other tools emerging too. and experiment with these. So that would be my thoughts. Overall, don't be careful about rushing to tokenization, because you might end up attracting the wrong people prematurely. And also, whereas otherwise, if you focus on intrinsic motivation and just getting stuff done, then you can also figure out mechanics on even compensating people pre-token as well with things like Coordinate. And then finally, you should just ask, okay, what sort of, how do we want to be self-sustaining in the future? Are we taking enough revenue where we're okay? Revenue from grants, revenue from, selling things, whatever, and do we want to tokenize from here, right? And then tokenizing wise, there's a few options and stuff too, right?
Yeah.
But even from without tokens, right? Like things like Ocean Market really expand the space of possible ways for data scientists to monetize, right? You can take the data that you create, like raw data, sell that, but you can also take, for example, models that you train, and then put those, on Ocean Market as private data sets, if you will, and then have some simple model inference algorithm on top that's run as the compute data algorithm, and you're selling the results of the inference, right? The model simulation. And like this can be a very nice business model. And there's a lot of other things like that too. So, traditional AI business models, you're either, as an AI startup, you're either going to get acqui-hired by Facebook or something, or you're going to be in a vertical that isn't fully valuing your AI skills. I was in the semiconductor world, and both my companies were like that, right? And we got acquired in both cases for 5x, 10x revenue, as opposed to 30x or 50x, which the public markets would reward you for. And that's because it's, in my case, I was in a vertical that had slower growth. We were growing fast, but the vertical didn't reward it. So anyway, I'll stop there. Hopefully you find that useful.
Yeah, no, thank you. Perfect. Back to you, Richard.
Yeah, very welcome. Taran, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for all of the insights so far. But actually, picking up from where Richard left and what you just now said, right, about data scientists not flocking this area compared to the other professions. I think one of the big reasons, like at least I'm still a bit of a skeptic myself. One of the big reasons is, like you said, usually AI is connected to these verticals. So like you mentioned, for you, that was a semiconductor industry. If it's Amazon or something like that, they have their recommendation system, but they're already selling something, and AI is an add-on. There are very few companies where AI is the business per se. So I want to understand, like, how does that problem fit in?
I think we lost them.
What Ocean is, for some things we can ask people to curate their sets, but for some things, like say if I'm trying to make a recommendation system for selling things, right, it's only I can only get there if I am already selling things. So
You went on mute, Tarun, but I think I can answer. There are two general purpose technologies that have went mainstream or near mainstream in the last 15 years. That is blockchain and AI. There's other ones that are, a bit more lower level that are, interesting, but not quite at the same level, things like IoT. But blockchain and AI are the two that really went mainstream as general purpose technologies. And by the way, there's other ones that are also, like, besides IoT, there's things like, pieces of synthetic biology and CRISPR and other stuff. But I really see blockchain and AI as the most general of all these. And, we talked about before how there's the centralizing versus decentralizing tendencies, but they also have another major difference. It is a lot easier to monetize and get sustainable in blockchain land than in AI land, right? So let's take that nugget of knowledge and then re-ask your question. Okay, if you're in AI land, and by the way, in blockchain land, you can even build general tools. And because of the nature of, tokens and all of that, then you can, and growing a community, it's sort of biased as well towards growing a larger community over time with tokens, longer term sustainability, all of that, right? And you can do this with token dynamics. Like, in Ocean, we have this Web3 sustainability loop. We've got a runway for decades, basically, right? If things go well, or infinity, right? Which is like really, really exciting, right? Versus, a traditional startup, you're quite often at, 6 months, 12 months runway, 12 months if you're lucky, right? So with this negative knowledge that the finances of blockchain world are much better than the finances of AI world, and as a startup, then leverage this. Say, okay, now we're going to be an AI blockchain startup in the sense of we're going to use blockchain as tools, but we're going to go for AI problems, right? And you basically twist it well enough such that you can take advantage of, token engineering of blockchain land, right? So eventually you do become a tokenized project where, and you have some means for sustainability, such as the Web3 sustainability loop. It's a really useful pattern. And it's very general, right? You could have it at every single stack. Ocean is at one stack, but you could have your data marketplace on top with its own tokens at another part of the stack, or at lower levels of the stack for your own L1, for example, etc. Right? So that would be a general pattern: is have a token design, like try to you could create generalized AI infrastructure that sits on top of Ocean or otherwise that is tokenized, following something like the Web3 sustainability loop, and that allows you to do a horizontal play in AI, yet survive as a startup, and not only survive but thrive, right? So I think it's a recipe that hasn't been talked about a lot, because it's really early days, right? No one has really thought about that a lot, but I have, and this is my recipe. And I actually find myself often recommending the Web3 sustainability loop to basically people asking, okay, how do I make my project sustainable and stuff, right? And it's pretty general. So and more and more teams have been adopting it, not just for AI, but for otherwise, right?
So do you think that an AI research company could just basically fork the Web3 sustainability loop, or do you think there's different dynamics of building a data marketplace compared to building an AI research company, for example, or R&D?
Yeah, so you don't have to, it's not about forking the marketplace. It's overall, or it's following the pattern of Web3 sustainability loop. And the key thing is in that loop is there's sort of this big box on the right that says ecosystem. And from that big box on the right that says ecosystem, the main thing you want to do is where your token design, the value goes up as your traction goes up. And to make that more tangible, you could make it where you're taking a percentage of transaction fees, so, or like, let's say of sales overall. So maybe there's, I don't know, $1 million a month going through your project somehow, right? You take 2% of that, and then you're getting 20K a month from that, for example, right? And with that revenue, you can feed it back into a resource allocation process. So in this case, if you're just a research organization like Algovera, then that's basically going to your mini DAO where you maybe that 20K a month you distribute it using Coordinate, for example, right? And that 20K could turn into 100K, whatever, right? But then you can also find other revenue streams over time. All of those revenue streams feed into the DAO, right? You can get Ocean DAO grants, grants from elsewhere, etc. And it's not just necessarily, you can take a cut of revenue, but you can also do things like have a discount token where if people are using whatever product you offer, if they hold your tokens, they get a discount, kind of like Binance has and most of the other exchanges have these days. After Binance released its coin, I think most of the other top 10 exchanges have their own coin, right? Like KuCoin has its own coin and many others, right? And several of them are in the top 100 coins because it actually just works really well, right? The main thing, once again, is that the token dynamics are set up such that as your traction goes up, the token can't help but go up, right? Because it's, there's just demand for the token, right? So that, the quick answer to your question is, yes, an AI research organization could follow the Web3 sustainability loop. And then, some near-term things you could do, publishing data sets, take, sales from that, feed into this. You could have publish your own Ocean market, fork, right? Like fork the front end and then tune it towards AI in some way, right? And other possible stuff. So there's lots of things that are pretty low-hanging fruit to do, even thanks to Ocean. And in Ocean, like, we're trying to make it really low friction for AI folks to be able to do this, right?
What do you think of using, we touched on this before, but the algorithm tokens, the algorithm data tokens as a vehicle for fundraising? I know it gets into securities issues and things like that, but even if we accept it as security, let's say we could launch, the idea of an algorithm that we want to build, and people invest in the algorithm token, and we're transparent, and we say, at a certain point in future, we want to withdraw a certain amount of the funds to fund R&D. So we might take out 50%, but we expect that the value that we add will be more than 2x. And so even though we're diluting people, we think you'll be better off. What do you think of that vehicle?
Well, I think overall it's fine, but you do have to be careful of, you know, what jurisdiction you're doing things in and stuff, right? So that would be the main thing. I know this model has actually served in our Weave ecosystem, PSTs. I think they're called profit sharing tokens. And they actually look a lot like data tokens, but they are a bit oriented this way more as well. And that was actually a big boost to the Arweave ecosystem. So I see that it can be used in this way, but you just have to be very careful with, you know, what jurisdiction you're in. There's another way to frame it, which is simply saying, you know what, it is a utility token to access this data set or set of data sets. And we're going to focus on simply getting revenue by, you know, making sure that it's really useful and a bunch of people download it, et cetera. And if it turns out that it's in great demand, et cetera, so more people start speculating on the price of that thing, then, you know, you've got a bunch of these tokens because, you know, people are paying you for them, et cetera, but you can hold on to them, and that basically helps you over time too. Your treasury grows, right? So just like, you know, inside Ocean Protocol Foundation, OPF has a treasury of a lot of Ocean tokens, and that helps for the Ocean Protocol Foundation sort of runway, but it's way more than enough for OPF core team, right? And that's why, you know, for Ocean DAO, we have the 51%, a chunk of that allocated towards Ocean DAO grants, but also because OPF has so many Ocean tokens itself, in its treasury, then it's you know, dumping a bunch of those, not dumping, sending a bunch of those Ocean into Ocean DAO, right? So the summary is, you can use those tokens however you like. You know, the design intent was around utility tokens, but it's not getting in your way if you want to use them in other fashions too. And even if they are used, you know, more directly as utility tokens, people are going to speculate on it. And frankly, I see that speculation as a prerequisite to price discovery. You can't have one without the other, almost, right? And I learned this by discussion with others like RIC and others, where we were just talking about stuff like this. And it was kind of like, when we first saw this in Ocean Market about a year ago, last fall, when we launched Ocean V3, we saw a bunch of speculation, and we're like, crap, how do we fix this? And then RIC said, Trent, this is okay. You know, this is a good thing because a market was born. And so, so basically, once again, speculation is a prerequisite to price discovery. So if you try to suppress speculation, then it means you're hurting price discovery, right? And we really wanted to solve, like the reason we brought the AMMs and stuff, we wanted price discovery of data sets, right? Like everyone was asking, how do you price data? How do you price data? And we're like, you know, our answer is so simple that it's almost boring. Simply, you know, the market decides, right? But it took a lot to arrive at, right? Like we wrote blog posts about this, and there's probably 100 research papers out there by various folks about how to price data. And in the end, what's you know, a really pragmatic answer? Let the market decide. So anyway, the market can also decide basically, you know, it's got speculation built in, and that can be beneficial for your runway, basically, is the point.
Great. I wonder, does anyone have any questions? We're coming into the last 10 minutes now. Maybe I'll open up the floor.
I've got maybe a general question, if that's right. So myself, and maybe there might be just a couple others in the room, I would consider myself a non-data scientist. So someone who potentially has a project that could be solved with AI. So how would I go about interacting with the community, a decentralized community, to either solicit a project like that, or commission, or just get people excited about helping me solve something like that?
Well, I mean, I push it back to everyone else in the room who is mostly data scientists, saying, hey, I've got a project, who wants to join me? So that would be my answer, right?
Yeah, I was going to say Algovera, which is what we've been talking about, Greg. But yeah, yeah. How do you think about the ownership of like different domain experts and data scientists coming together? You know, I guess you share the tokens and things like that. But what does that look like for you, do you think?
Well, I think you know, it does come down to relative contributions, et cetera. In general, you want to incentivize people to contribute value going forward, right? so you don't want to make it where a lot of traditional companies are set up where the founders get a bunch of, they get 100% of shares at the beginning. And then when employees come in, the employees are only getting to share 10%. And that's, and if the founders just founded the company a month before, it's kind of uncool, right? And then, so I think it's nice in that DAOs can be sort of collectives and have this disbursement of funds based on value added after the fact with things like Coordinate. I like that. So yeah, I think overall, if, within Algovera, people, at the end of, say, any given month, you all run through Coordinate, and each of you basically assign some points to how much you think everyone else contributed. Well, some of those contributors are data scientists, some of them are software developers, some of them are doing outreach and marketing, et cetera, right? And maybe you also have some sort of baseline that goes to everyone no matter what, just for being part of it, right? So I think that's a nice way to do it, right? And I actually look forward to more things like that emerging. And it's much simpler than traditional company structures too, right? I find traditional company structures a pain in the butt, right? And, they kind of are, there's a bunch of rigidity and you have to go through lawyers and all this, et cetera. But that said, whatever you're doing, you also should always try to be sure you're on the right side of the law, right? So, and there's two parts to that. There's A, do the right thing so that angry people don't sue you. And B, be aware of what the law is so that, and then as needed, get legal advice, right? But on the legal advice thing too, if you ask a lawyer for permission, they'll always tell you no, because they'll always try to minimize risk. So you don't ask lawyers for permission. Tell lawyers what you're doing and tell them that you want to, minimize risk subject to what you're doing, right? Or tell them any tweaks, but because otherwise they'll just tell you no for everything, right? So I think it's really important to make a separation. Like, don't ever ask for permission from lawyers. Instead, tell them what you're doing and get guidance on how to minimize the risk, right? But also as a startup, there's no need, like, don't take unnecessary risks, right? If there's 10 things you're doing, 9 of them should be as boring and mundane as possible, and 1 or 2 should be really risky, right? Where based on your hypothesis of your value add, right? So, you don't want to like change everything at once, because then your chance of failure is super high, right? Because every one risky thing maybe increases your chance of failure by 30% or something, right? So if you have 2 or 3 risky, like 1 or 2 risky things, then you've got a 50-50 chance. But if you've got 8 risky things, you're dead, right?
Great, yeah. And actually we're implementing SourceCred at the moment, so we're hoping to do Coordinate soon. So just shameless plug for Algovera.
Cool. That's awesome.
But I also see it kind of happening through grants as well. And so like we get grants from Ocean. Maybe we can use some of that to, give grants to our community for projects that we think are promising. So that's definitely on our roadmap.
Absolutely. And I know I'm speaking personally now because, no one can speak on behalf of Ocean DAO per se, right? But I think that'd be very useful. And it would, if you are saying, okay, we're going to give, use some of the Ocean DAO funds to grant more in the community, that's a very nice channel for the Ocean community, right? And I could see, if you say, okay, we're going to ask for funding X, but half of this is going to go to these other teams, and we're going to have it allocated according to this algorithm, with us, maybe you guys as curators to start with, maybe over time also using something like SourceCred or Coordinate there, or based on their own traction. That's really useful, right? Because, from an Ocean perspective, that's a really good way for Ocean to scale, but it's also very cool for Algovera, right? And yeah, I'm very excited for Algovera in general, because I see that, you guys have your own growing community of data science, especially around, and a lot of it around Ocean. That's wonderful, right?
Absolutely. Does anyone else have any questions they want to ask?
I maybe have a question. What do you think are the current biggest roadblocks in getting to this place where we can have a decentralized AI marketplace, and it's as easy as possible for external companies to use those AI models implement those AI models in their products? Because I feel like part of this journey is we're trying to separate these AI startups from the specific use cases. So we want data scientists to be able to just do their own cool projects, and then other people coming in and using those models. So yeah. I guess if that's handled by some kind of API, what do you think are the main components of that this needs to have?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's important to understand, I guess, that generally AI people work in Python, sometimes R, sometimes otherwise. So their workflows where they're using AI in production don't involve, pointing and clicking through a web-based GUI, right? So that means that there's a part of that workflow is going to be using probably OceanPy, and that's why we've gone way out of our way to always make sure OceanPy is there, because especially for the consumer side, right? So maybe you set things up where you bought someone has bought a data token where they're getting access, for a 1-month subscription to a data asset or something. And once there's that subscription where someone has bought it on the market that way, then their data scientist is then using that data token all the time for the consumer side, right? Like, or a set of data tokens. So it's sort of like, in the world of semiconductors, there's a CAD manager who's buying the tools for all the designers to use, and the designers just use it day to day. I could see a similar thing here, where there's maybe one or a few people that have responsibility around purchasing of data sets and so on, getting feedback from the data scientists, et cetera, and then the and they're interacting with Ocean Market, and then there's the data scientists themselves that are using those purchases, the data tokens, in order to basically accomplish their goals over time, right? And that's from a consumer side. There's also the publishing side, in the sense where, if you're an AI company that's creating value, you're publishing raw data sets or cleaned data sets or ML algorithms for inference, then, you're putting it up there, and maybe there's, groups with different responsibilities too. These are all hypotheses though. This is what makes sense to me. I think, in these early days, it's just really important to understand that these are hypotheses and conduct experiments, as cheaply as possible, to just try, right? Like, go to your data science friends, or to ask yourselves, like, how can we work with you? And ask each of your, like, a really useful question for each of you as data scientists is, I'm going to give myself 1 week. How do I go make money using Ocean, for example, right? What data set could I put out there that other data scientists would want to use, or that I've always wanted, right? And maybe it's just, taking some free data that's out there and cleaning it up, putting some feature vectors in, filling in some missing values. Maybe it's just taking some existing model that's out there and putting it into Ocean Market for easy inference. But maybe that's not enough, right? So I don't know, but that's a useful question to ask. How does each of you make money, and try to conduct a cheap experiment to see what happens. And in doing that experiment, you'll probably learn a lot, right? And I ask myself that question a lot too, and that's partly why I'm spending time at the things I am, and more. So even in TokenSpice, right? I've actually thought about taking TokenSpice and just running simulations of Ocean models, and then publishing those, and basically having the community buy those. All the Ocean speculators are going to be very curious in what those predictions are, right? So that could be pretty cool, right? So I could publish that, but as a founder of Ocean, then people might say, okay, this is Trent's thoughts on this. So I'm giving this to you guys as an idea. So take TokenSpice, run 10 different sets of parameters on it with, a bunch of different plots, and put that up for sale in Ocean Market, saying, here's our runs with these different parameter settings, right? That's an idea. Or other things too, right? Like, there's a bunch of ideas out there that are low-hanging fruit. So, think about it in the shower or whatever. And then once you come up with the idea, it might only take 10 minutes to implement, or half an hour, right? And then just see if you can make money. And going through that process, that's the point. Going through that process is what's going to help you to understand your own thinking as a data scientist, how to use Ocean, et cetera, right? And myself beyond, to give you other field, I see there's higher level tools for TokenSpice, where for things like verification of DeFi, et cetera, that's going to be very useful, as well as for trading systems, right? And so I have a lot of big plans for TokenSpice. And I do ask the question, how do I make money? But then, because I'm an Ocean founder, all that, then how do I make the money where I can feed it back into Ocean community, right? But my brain finds it easier just if I ask, how do I make money for myself first? And then I say, okay, now that I figured that out, now I'm going to build a thing and send it to the community. In your case, build a thing and send it to Algovera, right? Hey, I have to run. I have another meeting right now, but thank you very much. Yes, this is great. Great questions, guys. And thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining, Trent. Really appreciate it. And
cheers.
For anyone interested in discussing, we can discuss offline some of the ideas and stuff. So Thanks, Trent.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye everyone. See ya.